I've been thinking about it through the notions of memory and trace because this story that Pavan told me about this dude smuggling pornography from Canada to Calcutta. I was I was also very struck by the fragility of that memory. That if I hadn't been there to provoke Pavan to tell me these stories, uh, would have been lost, and this man would have been not acknowledged for the great work he did for the queer people back home. So that's why, this is coming back to one of the earliest points you raised, Helen. Why is it important that we do this? And I don't know. I can't articulate it why I feel that this memory is very precious and why it needs to be preserved for posterity. But I certainly do. I mean, I can't tell you why I'm so moved by it, but like I was very moved by this taxi driver telling me this story. I found it a gesture of not just caring, like, oh, I care about you, you don't need to confess your sexuality and your gender, but this is a gesture that I care about you, but also disaggregating what we mean by these huge concepts like South Asia, conservatism, class, and to link back to my first point on knowledge dissemination, I think there are in ways in which knowledge is structured, as May said, in academia, that actually makes it very important, necessarily like cuts all the messiness out, but maybe it's the messiness that we need to be actually focusing on. That's where the gold is. So yeah, that question of memory and trace uh, is how I'm trying to understand why I was so moved by these stories.
I know, for example, a lot of scholars who are also artists and creators talked a lot about, kind of intersecting the two. And I think this is an area where, like, a more creative methodology could kind of help us, right? Like, because on a short grant, you cannot say the rationale for the project is because you feel something in a taxi. But if you're making a documentary, you absolutely can say that, right? Like what sparks a creative project is often like, you know, exactly that, like a feeling. And so I think sometimes I think it's hard for us if we have to write grants and write proposal, kind of hard to start from that place, but maybe is exactly that we need to start from that place. And like what you talked about, the ephemeral memory, resonate with me because I kind of work with media, and in this current generation, the pre-internet doesn't exist. so I have a side project where I'm interested in the kind of queer Asian activism in Vancouver prior to this generation. And what struck me was that no one remembers it because it's not online. Like nothing was online, even like during the 90s and the 2000s where a lot was going on, but now there are no traces because, the flyers were lost, people, the burlesque dancer is now a suburban mom and doesn't want to talk about that past, and there's no trace. And so it's almost like, the feeling is that, oh, everything is just very presentist. And so I run into that too. For me, the challenge is sort of around, thinking about subculture prior to the internet, and how to kind of evoke them again in a way, that is interesting and productive and can be in conversation with what is the flourishing, post internet where every single thing is documented, right? Every single moment is now in Instagram or on Twitter. In contrast to before where you really have to unearth the traces.
I think that even those of us who document all of our lives online, which is not my right there's a lot of mess that is not on screen, right? That is not. So there's also a lot that doesn't happen in those spaces or has to be taken out of it. I mean, this is, this is, I think, these are questions or these are sort of the question of what it means to encounter these sort of traces, and then how to go looking for them, and what to do with them, right? Is preservation what we want to do? How do we care for them? How do we what do we do with them? It's something that I have been thinking a lot about as someone who works with, like, archives and materials and stories from the first half of the 20th century, and that's really been driven by the traces that I keep coming across, right? Like, of these moments of, I was just reading, a friend recommended, there's a little section of Brian Misumi's book on affect, and most of that book just goes right over my head. But he talks about the example as deviant, right? Like the deviant possibilities of the example. And here's where I think also that my training as a literary scholar, I think, informs also how I encounter archival materials. Because my training, the kind of close reading training that we receive is all about the detail and the particular, right? And it's about the kind of capacity, or one way, I mean, it's not the only sort of methodological sort of approach, but is this the capacity of the detail, of the particular, of the singular, to disturb, right? And to open up. And so that's been, I think, something that I came to a lot of the work, the material that I'm looking at with, and also that was really generated by an encounter with that material. And so for me, photography has been one place, I think, where, particularly kind of like amateur, vernacular, everyday photography, right? These moments, they're moments of arrest, but also often of mystery and opacity, that really kind of open this question of how do we come to this very tiny moment, right? Often insignificant, seemingly, but that opens up into speculative possibilities. It's the trace of lives, right, in space that I find really compelling, and provocative. But yeah, so I hope we can keep talking about this. I think it's really important, and also, kind of fun, right, and messy. And I'm struggling then at the same time with how to write about it. So that's the other, and what to do with this, right? Like, how do you then what kinds of narratives, and narrative structures do we need, or do I need, to be able to not capture precisely some of this messiness and opacity and elusiveness.
I like that idea of traces, because when I think of traces, I think of contours, um, and that could be because I'm trained in geography, so there's always like this idea of topography, where you're thinking of, you create an image through contours, or you used to, when you used to draw maps. So I feel like that is a really productive kind of place to think, is, thinking through the traces and what those traces might bring into relief. And I'm thinking about, I only get provoked to start thinking about them when people ask about the pre-internet days of community organizing and activism, and those stories start to come up. Like, in Helen, what you were both talking about, the stories of I think, for thinking about a genealogy of Filipino politics and struggles in Canada, it would take us to a place of thinking about our relationship to Indigenous women in the downtown East Side, and the work that was happening in the 80s and 90s, and how we were entangled and encountered each other there in daily spaces. That story hasn't been captured, like he was talking about, or documented. But I think they're just so formative. Those everyday encounters are so formative to where people are thinking now, that I don't know if that line has been traced over time, which would be really interesting to get into, which is, not my work, but would be interesting for any graduate students or undergraduate students watching.
And I think this, in some ways, I think knowledge dissemination has to somewhat change together. So it's not just documentary film where you can talk about how you were moved by the story, or a shirk grant, which is like, oh, give me money because I was moved. But maybe we need to find a common grant because, as Nadine was talking about photographs, and I come across so many photographs in my fieldwork without any history attached to them. And I was like, but who is this person whose photograph you've been carrying around for years and years and years? During my fieldwork in rural India with the hijras, a lot of these migrant laborers who would have affairs with hijras and then go back to their home villages. They would leave behind photographs. They would not, I mean, this was pre-smartphone days. um and so I don't know, I'm also not just content with like, oh, here is a feeling or a trace. I always want a certain kind of meaty evidence as well, almost legalistic. uh like oral history. So I think oral history, for example, is in some ways meets that point, where um yeah. So it's a challenge, I think, um intellectually, to cut across these various channels of thinking and feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason we also choose to work as scholar and not artists, right? So it's, I like how you put it, that you have to find the, I mean, we can be inspired by creative methodology, but in the end you also want to bring that back to a scholarly methodology.
Yeah, I'm captivated by this tracing and diaspora, and my mind immediately went to pre-internet days when we and a whole bunch of other Filipinos I know who were in diaspora used to trace our feet so that we can send the size of our feet back through letter to the Philippines to get shoes made. That I guess were unsatisfactory. The style was unsatisfactory here back in the 70s and 80s, and wanted the flair of the kind of the flair from where our parents were from in terms of the shoes, to get shoes sent to us from and made in the Philippines and sent to us in Canada. So yeah, I was thinking about diaspora traces, and I love V's. Like, I want to know who instead of less. Then I started thinking, who was making those shoes? What happened when our letters finally? I didn't even understand how the letters got there, but what happened once they landed in the Philippines? Who picked them up? Who took them to their local, shoemaker, and who made those shoes? Where did the material come from? Oh, V, that's like a lot of questions. That's gonna, like, it's gonna haunt me now this morning. I have to call my mom later.